Good morning, everybody. Looks like I've got several of you already. I'm done this in two places at once. Can you guys see me okay? Oh no, it's doing this again. This is the worst. Okay, it's doing the thing again where it's not allowing me into the live chat. And last time I didn't fix so. Be patient with me while I figure out some technical problems. Okay, let's see. What do I do if the live chat's not working? I learned what not to do, and that's don't reset. So, let me see here. Sorry, guys. But if I can't get your questions, this isn't worth much. If you haven't noticed, I sent you a copy of the slides that I used for this week talking about plants and fungi. So while you wait, you can make sure you have those downloaded and you can check those out. Come on. Okay. Please try again later. It acts like that's a thing I can just do. Just come back another time and do your live stream then. Come on. All right, if I can't get this figured out very shortly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to end this live stream and start a new one, and I'll send you guys the link. I apologize for the technical difficulties again. I think it's really cool, though, the way that it doesn't allow me into the chat. I think that's a nice feature. Okay, let's see here. I apologize once again. Okay, this might work. Hang on. Okay, let's see here. Is anything working? Do I have chat? That's going to be the big question. And this looks really laggy if this is the way it is. Come on. Come on. Load. Okay, I'm seeing some chats, sort of. So we might be getting close. Okay. Sorry, guys. That's really dumb because it's not giving me the chats when I start these. This is the same problem I had last time. And the only thing I did was I started it again and then it worked just fine. And so it looks like we're set, I think. The view I'm getting of myself, because I had to open up another window, is lagging big time. Am I that laggy in your view? Okay. Better mute myself. Is anything working? So you can see me just fine? Okay. Good news. The version of me I'm seeing is way, way, way behind, but that's all right. I'll just try to ignore what I look like to me. Here's something I can try. Okay. All right. So let's do this. I just sent you guys. Sorry. I've been trying to figure out what we're gonna do if I'm gonna switch over to using Zoom in the future. If I'm gonna stick with Facebook or with YouTube. So bear with me. But for now, I think I'm gonna stick with YouTube. I kind of like it. I sent you guys the notes that my normal slide presentation that I use for this section of the class. So I'm actually going to go ahead and open that on my computer as well so that I can make sure I cover everything. But if you don't have that yet, go ahead. Perhaps one day. You might have noticed my computer's not very fast. It's from 2009, though. I think it's doing pretty well, all things considered. Okay. How are you guys holding up with all the unpleasantness? Another thing we get to wait on. Well, while I wait for that to load, I'll see how you guys are doing. Yeah, I didn't send any special videos. I'm gonna just. So that's a good question. So. All right. Okay, so that's not true. All right. Yes, what I've heard is Zoom's okay, but that could change. That could change. Okay. So, let's see here. My presentation's loaded yet? Still no. It's just hanging out. Load. I just want to see what this computer's capable of. I'm like running 2 different streaming things at the same time. Huzzah! All right, everything's going our way. So, I want to start off by talking about photosynthesis. And you guys have a slide. There are videos built into a lot of these. I'm not necessarily going to go through all of them today, but I do definitely want to go over photosynthesis. So we're talking about a few groups of organisms today. We're talking about the plants and, if time allows, the fungi as well. And the relationship of plants, animals, and fungi looks like this. So that is what that relationship looks like between the plants, the animals, and the fungi. Hopefully you can see that okay. If you haven't noticed, the fungi and the animals are actually more closely related to one another than either of them are to plants. And so when we usually like to lump plants and fungi together because neither of them go anywhere. But fungi are actually more similar to animals than they are to plants. But we might still be talking about them today. What I definitely want to talk to you about, the first thing, is photosynthesis. And if I wrote out the reaction, well, if I wrote this out here, so I'll just write this out. C6H12O6 plus O2 goes to form H2O plus CO2 plus energy. This right here. This would be my reaction for, it could be cellular respiration, or it could also be combustion. It could be a fire that I'm drawing. If I flip that arrow around, where I have energy, in this case from the sun, plus water plus CO2 makes oxygen and glucose, that would be photosynthesis. And photosynthesis, probably not too shockingly to you at this point, is what plants use to create sugar. And plants not only use sugar for their energy needs, and they do cellular respiration just like we do, but they also pretty much build themselves out of sugar, and they make it themselves. But I want to talk to you about the process, because if you look at the notes, you'll see there's a diagram that shows the process of photosynthesis and what that looks like. It's not quite complete, and I definitely want to walk you through this one step at a time to make it make a little bit more sense. So can you all see that just fine in the notes? Give me a little feedback on that real quick. Yeah. All right. Huzzah. In that case, I want to draw out photosynthesis for you. So this all takes place in the chloroplasts, and hopefully this isn't a new thing, because we actually talked about this early in the semester when we talked about plant cells. But, move the screen a little. But, exactly what's going on, I want to talk about. So there are two big stages to photosynthesis. One of them is called the light reaction. Even though you have most of this diagram in the notes that I just provided to you, I still strongly recommend that you draw this out right now with me, because it's kind of a pain to memorize unless you understand what's going on there. So one of the things is the light reaction. And the other thing historically has been called the dark reaction. But that's not a very good name for it. It actually has multiple names. The Calvin cycle, like you can see there. Also the light independent reaction, which is a much better name than the dark reaction, because the light reaction is called the light reaction because it requires light. And so actually we can go ahead and draw that on there, that the light reaction requires light. Hopefully you already knew that plants use light, and they use light to do the light reaction. They've also got this thing, I'm going to write it on here as the Calvin cycle. I'm not writing it on as the dark reaction, even though you'll hear it called that sometimes, because the light reaction is called the light reaction because it requires light. And so calling the dark reaction gives people the impression that it requires darkness, and it does not. It does not require darkness. Slide that back a little bit so you can see me a little bit. It does not require darkness. It just doesn't require light. So it's light independent. And so that's the Calvin cycle. Okay, so these are the two things, the light reaction and the Calvin cycle. Now, we know some of the things that plants need, and probably the thing that's the most obvious they need is light and water, and they need both of those things for the light reaction. And so water, H2O, goes into the light reaction. And all that the light, so here we go. All that the light reaction is doing is it's ripping the hydrogens off of water. And the reason it's ripping hydrogens off is because it's trying to make glucose. Okay, so at the end of all of this, light reactions first, Calvin cycle second. At the end of all of this, what we hope to get out of this is glucose, H12. So this guy down here, that is what we're trying to make. And I'm getting the hydrogens, those 12 hydrogens, I'm getting those from water. I'm just ripping the oxygen off and taking those hydrogens and using them to build my molecule. And now, of course, water has more in it than just hydrogen. It's also got oxygen. And as far as the light reaction is concerned, because all the light reaction is doing is ripping off the hydrogens to make glucose, that oxygen is just garbage, just trash oxygen. And oxygen's more stable when there are two oxygen molecules that are bound together as O2. And so it tends to just throw oxygen away. Oxygen is just garbage. It's garbage, and nobody likes it. And so out it goes. Okay. In fact, this is an interesting thing. When photosynthesis first evolved, or first appeared on the planet, it was throwing away all this oxygen. Well, there wasn't very much oxygen in the atmosphere, and nothing really on Earth was adapted to using oxygen or even being in a high oxygen atmosphere. And so oxygen was actually a toxic gas that caused one of the greatest mass extinctions in history. It just killed off so many things when lots of organisms started doing photosynthesis and releasing all this oxygen into the atmosphere. So anyway, this is toxic garbage that now organisms can use pretty well, but at the time when this first happened, only a handful could not die in the presence of all this oxygen. Anywho, so I've got all this garbage oxygen and I've got hydrogen, but I have hydrogen not in the right place. This isn't where I need hydrogen to be. I need hydrogen over in the Calvin cycle. And to get it over there, I'm going to need a truck. And this truck is called NADP+. Okay, so this is the truck. And the truck comes into the light reaction, and it gets loaded up with hydrogens. Once it has a hydrogen loaded onto it, it becomes NADPH. And that H is just the hydrogen now loaded onto the NADP plus truck. And the NADP plus truck then delivers the NADPH, mostly the H. It delivers that to the Calvin cycle. Once the H is pulled off, it becomes NADP plus again, so it becomes an empty truck, and it can be sent back around to pick up more hydrogen from the light reaction. So it's just a constant cycle of loading and unloading this truck that is called NADP plus, and when it's loaded up, it's got that H on there, it becomes NADPH. At this point, do you guys have any questions? All right. If not, let's keep talking. So right now, I have the hydrogens that I need to make glucose, C6H12O6. And that's neato. But glucose isn't made of just hydrogens. Glucose is made of carbons, oxygens, and hydrogens. And so I still need carbon and I need oxygen, which is tragedy because I just threw a bunch of oxygen away. If only there was just a ton of carbon and oxygen just floating around like all in one molecule in the atmosphere all over the place. That'd be super handy. And the neat thing is, there's a lot of this. It's called CO2. So CO2 is going to be the source of my, so if you can see that, I've added CO2 on. CO2 is the source of my carbons and oxygens that I'm going to need to complete this molecule, C6H12O6. Now, it is worth mentioning that in order to rip apart this CO2 molecule and assemble this C6H12O6 molecule, I'm going to need some energy. And the Calvin cycle, also known as the light independent reaction, or the dark reaction, which I think is a misnomer, because it can run in the light or the dark. But the key here is it can run without light because it's not using energy from light directly to power this reaction. However, I do need some energy in here to tear apart this CO2 and to build this C6H12O6. And just like any other cell, the energy source that it's going to use to do this is ATP. So I got some ATP down here. And I'm going to put this ATP into the Calvin cycle because I need energy to power that reaction. Well, the way that ATP works, especially if you're in chemistry, is I get energy by breaking a bond. So I'm actually removing one of the phosphates. So it's adenosine triphosphate. That's what ATP stands for. And when I rip one of the phosphates off, it becomes ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, which you'll notice is one fewer phosphate. And then also what I call inorganic phosphate, PI, which is just a phosphate all by itself. So once I rip one of those phosphates off, well, what's happening is I'm breaking a high energy bond and it forms a lower energy bond and I get a net release of energy. That's only if you're in chemistry. I'm not making you memorize it. It's just some people are bothered because it takes energy to break a bond. And so it's like, well, how am I getting energy from breaking that bond? Well, it's because I'm breaking a high energy bond and forming a low energy bond. And there's a net release of energy. But I've now made ADP and inorganic phosphate. And that's great, except I'm using energy now to make energy. And somehow I've got to reassemble this ATP molecule. If only I had a source of energy, like renewable energy that just came up every day that I could use to reassemble that molecule. And good news, I do. It's called the sun. And so I send this ADP and inorganic phosphate back to the light reaction. I send it back over to the light reaction, where it gets reassembled into an ATP molecule that can be then used in the Calvin cycle once again. And at this point, I have all of the information that was on my original figure. You guys noticed that. I will tell you, though, the first time I ever taught this class, I had a horrifying realization. I was taught basically this figure. This figure's in tons of textbooks all over the place. I'd never thought too much about it until it was like, well, I got to explain this to other people now. And I sat down and I looked at it and I went, okay. So I'm trying to make this molecule here, which is C6H12O6, which has the same number of carbons and oxygens. I don't know if you can see that. Okay. Has the same number of carbons and oxygens, which is that's just dandy, right? I'm thrilled with that. But I don't have, well, the molecule I'm using in order to do this has 2 oxygens for every carbon, which, between you and me, I mean, that's twice as many oxygens as carbon. So it seems like I got a whole lot of oxygens that I don't know where they're going. Right? I always had this great fear that some student would be like, what happens to the other oxygen from CO2? And I'd be like, I don't know. I should mention, I taught this class for years. No one ever asked me that question. And then one semester, 2 class periods in a row, somebody asked me, what happens to the other oxygen from CO2? And I told them, thank you so much for asking me that, because I spent a whole day of my life trying to figure it out. And here's what I learned. So I knew that O2 only came out of the light reaction. CO2 goes into the Calvin cycle. Essentially, CO comes out. I don't know what happens to the other O. And so I was bothered by this. And my background is in zoology, which is a study of animals. I had 1 plant class in my undergraduate. My master's was in evolutionary ecology and my PhD in biology education research, and specifically evolution also. So I'm like, I studied beetles and people, and I don't know too much more than what I learned in my 1 plant class about this, and they didn't tell me what happens to that other oxygen. So I went to some graduate students that study plant physiology, and I said, what happens to the other oxygen from CO2 in the Calvin cycle? And they're like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well, I got C6O6 coming out. That's the same number of carbons and oxygens. But I got CO2, which is twice as many oxygens as carbons going in, and oxygen only comes out of the light reaction. And they're like, boy, I don't know. I don't know. And so they pointed me to their advisor, who's a BYU professor in plant physiology, right? And I said, so I went to him and I said, okay, what happens to the other oxygen and CO2 in the Calvin cycle? And he goes, what are you talking about? And I went, well, I got the same number of carbons and oxygens coming out, but I got twice as many oxygens as carbons going in. And O2 only goes out in the light reaction. And he went, I don't know. And I'm like, well, I didn't say this to his face. This is just what was running through my head. I'm like, aren't you a plant physiologist? Like, isn't this sort of like the main reaction in plant physiology? But anyway, I left, no answer. I then talked to my then at the time PhD advisor, who did not study plants. She studied some human physiology and disease stuff, and biology education stuff. And I was like, what happens to the other oxygen in CO2 in the Calvin cycle? And she said, I don't know. But then she pulls down an old book from her college days and opens it up, and it's all highlighted and stuff like she read it, which is just crazy. And she pages through for a while, and she finds this diagram, and it explains what happens to that other oxygen. And this is the thing that's never on these. I'll even draw it. I'll draw it in red because it's so important. So sometimes, in fact, half the time, when an NADPH arrives at the Calvin cycle with its hydrogen, the hydrogen's like, hey, okay, I'm here. I'm ready to be glucose. And the Calvin cycle goes, yeah, here's the thing. We are glad you're here, and we think you're doing a really great job of helping us make glucose, right? Couldn't do it without you. But I don't know if you noticed this, but we're bringing in twice as much oxygen as we are carbon, and we need the same amount of oxygen and carbon. And so we got to get rid of some of this oxygen, but oxygen only comes out of the light reaction. So here's what I need you to do. I need you to pair up with one of your buddies. So you're H, right? I need you to be H2 into an H2O molecule, and bring that H2O back to the light reaction. And I'm sure that hydrogen's like, but I was just H2O. I got ripped off of the H2O and sent over here to be glucose. And they're like, yeah, I know, that's the worst. I'm sorry, anyway. But off you go. And so another something that comes out of here is water. That's that, and it ships that extra oxygen over to the light reaction, where the hydrogens are ripped off again and then shipped back over to the Calvin cycle, so that this time they might get to live their dream of becoming a glucose molecule. There's also the possibility they'll just get hooked back to an oxygen and sent back over. And the thing is, I need to get rid of one out of every two oxygen molecules that come into the Calvin cycle. And so actually half of all hydrogens that arrive at the Calvin cycle do that, and the other half become glucose molecules at any given time. Of course, if you get sent back over to light reaction, you end up coming back to the Calvin cycle. It's just you got to make at least one more rotation. It's a possibility you just make that rotation indefinitely, but it's 50-50 every time you show up. So that is photosynthesis in a nutshell. Now let me get back so I can see your questions. Does that make sense? What else would you like to know? I assume you were going to ask me about what happens with that other oxygen, Jerry. That's good. Yeah, that is the question you should be asking. Man, what the heck happens to that other oxygen? It'll plague me for life. All right. Well, good news. Good news. In that case, yes, you do need to know about the extra oxygen. What happens to it? Essentially, if you can draw this diagram, Make sure that's, you can see it. If you can draw this diagram, you're going to be in good shape. You know, I could ask you questions about it, but you know, you being able to draw this is pretty much going to cover you. But that's the one big thing to add to the diagram that's in the notes that I gave you. The main thing is, the reason I went through it like this is I want you to understand this diagram, because it makes it a lot easier to remember it if you understand why it's doing the things that it's doing. So if you haven't drawn it yet, draw it. You know, this will be up so you can watch it again and practice. Okay. If you don't have any other questions about that, and if you do, shoot them. Okay. Wait. So water goes in the light and out of the dark. Okay. So yes, water goes into the light and out of the dark. Water also comes from the environment, but water is the way that the Kelvin cycle gets rid of extra oxygen. It makes water and then sends it back over to light reaction to have the hydrogen stripped back off. Yes, Simona, that you got it just right. The Kelvin cycle is powered by ATP, and light reaction is powered by the sun. If you end up having more questions down the road about this too, feel free to ask them here. I'll see them. But I'll move on a little bit so we can see our presentation. So let's see here. Okay. Ah, yeah, this is good fun. So you can see there's a phylogenetic tree that's in the notes quite a bit. It's probably not even a super duper complete phylogenetic tree. There are a lot of groups, but you'll notice, and I should add, you know, one thing that is a little different from when this phylogenetic tree first came to be is that the eukarya actually probably are kind of smack dab in the middle of the archaea. So the archaea probably aren't a monophyletic group by themselves without including the eukarya in it. But I've got this group of protists, we've talked about them before, which are basically all the eukarya except for the plants, animals, and fungi, which makes Protista definitely garbage. I don't even think that the plants, animals, and fungi by themselves are a monophyletic group. The plants kind of come out of a group of protists, photosynthetic protists that we call algae. So plants are essentially land algae. But I do have a good question here, which is, so there's all these algae, which are eukarya, that do photosynthesis. And the big question is, where did photosynthesis first evolve? And the eukarya are not the only place we see photosynthesis. We also see photosynthesis in photosynthetic bacteria. And I'm going to make a new drawing. So there are, and let's see if I have a green mark. If I do, that'd be spectacular. If I don't, it's just a tragedy. Oh well, you'll pretend that blue is green today. So there are these, there are these photosynthetic bacteria. And I've drawn them this way because they're a cell and they've got a ring of DNA in them. And there's a lot of these photosynthetic bacteria. Well, the eukarya that do photosynthesis, they all have this structure called a chloroplast. And interestingly enough, a chloroplast is exactly the same size as these photosynthetic bacteria. It also has a ring of DNA inside of it, which shares a heck of a lot of genetic information with these photosynthetic bacteria. And like mitochondria, they have not one, but two cell membranes, which very much leads us to conclude that chloroplasts are photosynthetic bacteria. Just like mitochondria are bacteria, chloroplasts probably are themselves photosynthetic bacteria that were swallowed up by a eukaryotic cell at some point and not digested. Should explain the two membranes and the ridiculous similarities between the chloroplasts and photosynthetic bacteria that we see today. And so the eukarya actually probably never evolved photosynthesis. They just hijacked some photosynthesizing bacteria, and now those bacteria live in their cells. And the photosynthetic and the eukarya provide essentially the water, CO2, and access to light that the bacteria need, and the bacteria leak out some sugar as a way of saying thank you for not digesting me many, many, many generations ago. So that is what a chloroplast is essentially, and so photosynthesis really only evolved, sorry, in the bacteria, and it was hijacked by endosymbiosis by the eukarya, just like mitochondria were. Okay. So let's see here. How does photosynthesis and animals that have bioluminescent processes compare from a plant point? So bioluminescence, though I don't have a ton of understanding of exactly what the chemical reaction is that happens with bioluminescence, it's probably different depending on which bioluminescent organism you're talking about. That is the generation of light in cells, in living things. And so it's kind of a completely different process from photosynthesis. Hopefully that answers that question satisfactorily. If not, we can look it up and answer it in greater detail later. Okay, so we got that. I want to talk now about what ties plants, or what ties algae to the water, because algae live in the water. And so this is slide number 8 if you want to see it yourself. But algae are photosynthetic organisms. They live underwater, which is convenient because there's a lot of access to water in the water. And also, as a result of living in the water, their structure is supported by buoyancy, which is kind of a big deal. It means they don't get squished so much. They don't crush under their own weight because buoyancy lifts them up. This is a little known fact, and I hate to brag, but I can do a handstand on one finger with one arm as long as I'm submerged in the water. It's not exclusively because I have superhuman powers. It's probably largely because buoyancy is supporting almost all of my weight, and it's delightful. And it's the same way for algae. Algae release their gametes into the water, and gametes don't dry out because it's hard to dry out underwater. They don't need a whole lot of anchorage, just enough so they don't essentially drift away. And this makes sense because their mass is supported by buoyancy. And they get nutrients to the entire body because they're all in the water. And their whole body can do photosynthesis. Well, there's a lot of things about that don't work so well on land. One of them is gravity. And in order to, I'll make a list here, actually. I'm not going to do gravity per se. I'm going to erase photosynthesis real quick. So gravity is not so much my problem as it is that I'm not structurally sound enough, and then gravity becomes a problem. So in order to overcome this gravity problem, I'd need to have a stronger structure. Also on land, let's see, just looking at my list of problems, Gametes dispersed by water that don't dry out. I'd have to have some way to disperse my gametes not using water. Okay. Even if I were really strong, I couldn't stand upright without like really good anchorage. Not to mention the fact that there's often not any water available above ground. And so I would probably need some sort of roots in order to stand on land. Now there's a huge problem with roots. And that is that roots are underground. And that's a huge advantage because underground is where the water is, and you can't do photosynthesis without water, but you also can't do photosynthesis underground. Little known fact. And so plants living underground, those cells should die unless there is a way to move sugar from above ground where there's light and they can do photosynthesis down to the roots. And so in order to have roots, you'd need to be different in that you'd have to be able to move sugar down. And moving sugar down to the roots solves about half of your problem, but you've got a bigger problem, which is if I've got photosynthetic structures, like let's call them leaves. If I have leaves that are up above the ground where there is no water, I still can't do photosynthesis. And so not only do I need to be able to move sugar down, but I'd have to be able to move water up. If I can't do those two things, then I can't have roots. And I can't really have leaves unless those leaves are sitting in water. So being able to move sugar down and water up would require something called a vascular system. And I'll show you what I've been writing here in a second. Okay, so that's what I've been writing. So I need a stronger structure. I need to be able to disperse my gametes without using water. I'd need to have roots. Roots in a vascular system would help my problem of obtaining nutrients through my entire body, because if my body gets really rigid and strong, it means I can't collect nutrients with the whole thing, especially if it's not all in water, and I can't do photosynthesis with the whole thing. But if I could move sugar and water around inside my body, then I could do that. So these are sort of the three big things that would need to be different about algae in order for it to survive on land. And what I'm going to look into next is in what order would these things be essential? If you've ever been on the beach in California, you've probably noticed there's a lot of kelp that ends up washing on the beach. And kelp does a lot better than most algae, but if you ever see algae on land, it's not looking good. It looks horrible. And it looks so horrible largely because it's just like flat, crushing under its own weight. They're just not structurally strong enough. It's really like its inability to, move sugar up and water down and reproduce on land without water. That's all sort of a moot point because it's just squishing itself under its own weight. And so, and correct me if you think this is just pure madness, but I think thing number one that would have to be different, it seems like usually when I have a more regular class, we agree about this, that stronger structure would be priority number one. Not that it would care, it's just that algae gets washed onto the beach all the time and most of it dies. And if there was ever an algae that was going to be able to survive still on the beach, it would be some algae that had a slightly stronger structure than most. And so the first plants on land were probably algae that had a slightly stronger structure than other algae, so that when they got washed on land, And, you know, being up kind of right on the beach, you're still probably getting wet quite a bit. So you can probably still do some photosynthesis. You know, the water's washing onto you. You know, you can still throw your gametes in there. So everything else is sort of taken care of as long as you're really close to the water. And in fact, they just have a slightly stronger structure so they can live on land as long as it stays pretty damp about all the time. They don't have any roots. They're not going under the ground. It's just they sit in places that are wet. Their whole body does photosynthesis. They throw their gametes into the water. And we call these things like moss and let's see, what are some of the other goodies that are in this group of plants? Hornworts and liverworts and stuff like that. Those are plants of this nature. And I've got some actually right in here, so I'll be right back. Hang on. Let's see here. I don't think I can move you far enough to show you this one, so I'll be right back. Okay. So here's some moss. And I was able to just pick it up out of where it was because as a moss, it doesn't have any roots or nothing. It does photosynthesis with its entire body. And you know, it's just strong enough so it doesn't crush under its own weight. It can live anywhere that stays damp about all the time. And when it comes time to reproduce, it just chucks its gametes into the water. It's a moss, and isn't it lovely? So, moss. It's a great day. It's a great day for moss. Any questions about mosses so far? If not, I get to show you some craziness with moss. So moss is some bonkers stuff, and I love it, especially when it comes to their reproduction. And I think I've got a figure on this. Yeah, so the figure's slide 11. Don't even look at it just yet. Just know you have this information. But go ahead and draw this out with me just to wreck your day. Just to wreck your day. And this is actually what algae do as well, but it's just pretty bizarre. So we'll start in a very normal place. Okay, we'll start with a zygote. Okay, that seems like a very good place to start. So a zygote. Hooray! A zygote is diploid, and I'm writing out diploid as 2N. The reason I'm doing this so you're familiar with 23andMe. So 23andMe, that's the number of different kinds of chromosomes that you have. You have 23 different kinds of chromosomes, but actually you've got 46 of them, because for each of those 23, you've got one from mom, one from dad. So whatever the number of different kinds of chromosomes is that you have, you've got 2. And so diploid is 2 times the number of chromosomes types that you have, 2N. So that's how I'm saying a zygote is diploid. You probably know this. Zygotes, what they do is they do a whole bunch of mitosis, and they become an adult, and that adult is called a a sporophyte. A sporophyte. And a sporophyte is also diploid, as you would expect. And so, just check one thing real quick. Okay, so that sporophyte is diploid, as you would expect. And right here at this point in the diagram to talk about this question. Okay, so okay, so I got a few questions. How long would it take to have moss as a lawn? Not very long. In fact, it'd be stinking rad. It's just you'd have to keep your lawn really, really wet, pretty much all the time. Like you'd have to wet it. It would take a lot more water than the lawn does because moss don't pull water out of the ground like grass will. How do non-vascular plants transfer nutrition? There's a little bit of transfer that can happen like to neighboring cells and stuff, but for the most part, they don't. And that's a big limiting thing for them. Something you'll notice about mosses is they're tall. They don't get tall because all of their body needs to be basically where the water is all the time. And all of their body also needs to be where the sun is all the time. And so they're just big, long, and flat so that every single one of their cells can do photosynthesis every day. How do plants that without light perform photosynthesis? I don't think there are plants that grow in caves without light. If you find out about one though, like I'd be really interested in knowing about it, but I don't think there are any cave plants. So again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think they can. There are some plants that they end up growing, like I've seen plants that are like growing underneath a rock. And I don't know if it's because there's part of that same plant that's not underneath the rock and it's growing a part of itself in a bad place. I'm not sure what's going on there. But back to this. So the zygote does mitosis. Hang on, I'm going to change to a different window. Okay. So the zygote does mitosis. It produces a sporophyte, which is an adult. And the adult does meiosis just like anybody else. And the meiosis, though, doesn't result in gametes. It results in something called a spore. So a sporophyte makes spores. And there's a reason that I'm not calling, and unsurprisingly, because it did meiosis, the spore is haploid, which I just represent with N. I mean, it's the same as 1N, but if you've done algebra, like I don't need to say the 1. It's just N, because it doesn't have 2 for every type of chromosome anymore. It just has 1. So I call it a spore. I don't call it a gamete. And the reason I call it a spore and not a gamete is because gametes need friends, and spores do not. And so the spore, what it will do is it'll land somewhere, and it will just start doing mitosis. And it will grow up all by its onesie into an adult called a gametophyte. Now the gametophyte, because it comes from a haploid spore that never found a friend, the gametophyte is also haploid, which should just ruin your day, just ruin it. But here we are. The haploid gametophyte makes gametes, okay? So it'll either make sperm or it'll make eggs. And being a moss, you know, it'll just chuck those into the water to find each other. And so those will get together and fuse just like anybody else and form a new zygote. So, and I'll even write fuse. So those are going to fuse together, the sperm and the egg. You can see those clearly, sperm and egg. Those will fuse and form a new zygote. The sperm and the egg, of course, are haploid. But this is the thing that should ruin your day more than anything, which is what process do they use to make sperm and eggs? Now, normally, that would be meiosis if the gametophyte were diploid, but it's not. And because it's not, it doesn't need to cut its genome in half. It needs to pass on that whole half that it has. And so it doesn't use meiosis to make gametes. It uses mitosis to simultaneously ruin your day. And so this is the life cycle of moths. Okay. I'm now ready for your questions and complaints about this horrible reality of mosses. But I'm going to put this guy somewhere damp real quick. So you write questions. I'm going to put him somewhere damp. Weird, correct. That is well put. That's exactly what's going on here. And it's upsetting to no end. Okay. I'm going to cover one more group of plants today, and then I'm going to call it a day, unless you guys would. Yeah, we'll call it there. Well, I will give you this little bit of heads up as far as what I'm planning. I think I'm going to finish the plants and the fungi, and then that's going to be the end of this unit for this next exam. Yeah, and so I think we'll get done with plants and fungi. Probably what I'll do is I'll do we'll do this next Thursday. So you keep going through the notes that I just gave you. There are some YouTube videos embedded in there, and just try to understand everything. And then on Thursday, I'll finish up discussing plants and fungi with you guys and answer any questions you have. It'll be kind of like our review session. And then the following Tuesday will be the exam. Okay, so a week from this coming Tuesday will be your first online exam. Okay. But our next issue, I would say, if you can't, if you have stronger structure, then you can do what mosses do, which is you can live in places that are wet pretty much all of the time. Because you can still check your gametes into water because it's wet there about all the time. And you don't need roots or anything because it's wet where you are. But you're very, very tied to that. If you're going to move anywhere that is less wet than that, you wouldn't necessarily need to be able to disperse your gametes without water as long as it rained sometimes. But you need to be able to do photosynthesis more than just sometimes. And so you'd have to be able to get water even when it's not wet above ground. And so roots would probably be the next stage. You'd need to have the stronger structure, but then you'd also need to have a vascular system. And so the next group of plants we want to talk about are what are called seedless vascular plants. These are things like ferns. I'll go get a couple. And if you haven't noticed, ferns, they can get a lot taller than can mosses. And they also, because they can have roots underneath the ground, they can live in places that are a lot drier than the places where mosses can live. And that's pretty dang neat. And so, they've got a couple of things going for them. They've got a vascular system. So they can move sugar down and water up. And I want to talk about the structures that they use to do this. So I'll let you do this experiment on your own. You've maybe done it on your own anyway in the past without even knowing it. But if you would be to take a cup of water and a strip of, say, paper towel, and you dipped just the tip of the paper towel in the water and just held it there for like 10 minutes, you would notice that the most magical and seemingly counter-gravity thing will occur, which is that water will go up. This is due to something called capillary action. And your paper towel, what it's made out of is dead plant cells. Well, dead plant cells, through capillary action, bring water up. And so the portion of the vascular system in a plant that brings water up are just some dead cells in the middle that are called xylem, X-Y-L-E-M. And this is maybe not that helpful. So xylem is what those are called. And I remember that they're called xylem. Well, I remember that the xylem are the dead plant cells because paper is dead plant cells, and Xerox, like making a Xerox copy, which is one of the few other X words I know, that also involves paper. I don't know if that'll help you, but it works for me. Anyway, the xylem, what it is, are they're dead plant cells. And dead plant cells bring water up. Well, you might also be familiar with a wonderful liquid called maple syrup. Maple syrup is delicious because it's got lots of sugar in it. Well, what it turns out is that maple syrup, at least true maple syrup, is the vascular fluid from a maple tree that transports sugar down. And being a fluid, it flows. And this structure is called phloem. Phloem. And I remember that phloem flows. And Xerox starts with an X, and so does xylem, and they're both dead plant cells. It's not great, but it's the best I have. And so they've got this xylem and this phloem that transport sugar down and water up, so that they can do photosynthesis above ground and so that they can not die below ground where they can't do photosynthesis. So let me make sure. Is everything on the review notes that you gave us last week still going to be on the test? Yes, I think I cut it off at the right point on that review. And the review for the next exam I gave you last week. So you already have the whole review for the next exam. I should mention one other thing though about these ferns and other things like ferns, which is that they still do this. There are two forms of adult ferns. There's a haploid gametophyte adult, and there's a diploid sporophyte adult. Sporophytes make spores, gametophytes make gametes. Just to wreck your day. And I think that's all the content I'm going to cover today about plants. Next Thursday, we'll talk about how they disperse gametes without water, and we'll finish up the plants and we'll talk about the fungi, and then that'll be the end of it, and then I'll do review questions the rest of the time, probably for about as long as you guys want to go, because the next class will be the exam. So like I said, you've already got the review. I gave you the review last week, and here's a bunch of good stuff today about plants. Remember, I sent you my presentation. There are some videos that you can watch embedded in that, or not necessarily embedded, but linked in that presentation. So, okay, so ferns are typically close enough to the water to disperse their gametes there. Yes, absolutely. Now, the big thing about it is, it's not that it has to be wet all the time, but you will not find ferns anywhere that doesn't get soaked at least once a year. So, there's got to be like a big rainy season, or ferns can't be there. And whereas with moss, it needs to be wet pretty much all the time. With ferns, it only has to be really wet when they reproduce. But that has to happen, or they can't do it. Oh, thanks for telling me that, Jerry. I'm doing my best. This is kind of fun. It is a lot more fun when you guys are actually here. But you saying that means a lot. Okay, so how did early bacteria get it? So the first life forms probably, at least as far as we can tell, they probably lived around the deep hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. And those deep hydrothermal vents, around there you find bacteria that do something called chemosynthesis, which is a little bit like photosynthesis, except it doesn't use light from the sun. It uses the energy coming out of these hydrothermal vents. And so that is probably where the first life forms were. And there were probably either you did chemosynthesis or you ate guys that did chemosynthesis. And photosynthesis came along much later, but that allowed organisms to disperse away from just these hydrothermal vents. Everything was tied to that until photosynthesis. And then as far as eukaryotic organisms go, I mean, eukaryotic organisms were eating photosynthetic bacteria and other bacteria and other eukaryotes and stuff for a long time before the first broken eukaryote came that just forgot to digest his photosynthetic bacteria that he ate. Thank you, Simona. I'm really happy to hear that, because I feel like it's so different, and I apologize for all the technical issues. Trying to figure it out. So should be fun. I really actually had a great time talking about plants just now. I'm like, I gotta make a video about plants now, because plants are stinking rad. Well, I'll hang around for the next little bit, and so if you guys have more questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, you're free to go. Thank you for being here today. So I did a quick search and I did find that a few species of plants that are not. Oh, that makes sense. So for those of you not reading this, Dylan said there are a few species of non-photosynthetic plants that survive by being parasites. So these are what you call heterotrophic. So we are heterotrophic organisms. So we're arguably plant parasites because we can't make our own sugar, so we have to steal it. And so we're a heterotroph, which means other eaters or different eaters. We eat things that are not ourselves. Plants are what you call autotrophs because they make sugar, they make themselves out of sugar, and they also eat sugar that they make. And so they're arguably eating themselves. They're self-eaters, autotrophs. Most of them, but apparently there are a few lineages of plants that have managed to survive in places without light because they have become heterotrophs again, which is bodacious as all get out. And I appreciate you sharing that with us. Oh, yes, you do. Yes, you do. You should also explore why there are carnivorous plants, because if you think about it, they don't need any sugar. They make their own. So what are they stealing? All right. Well, I'm gonna let you guys go. Thank you so much for being here today, and I'll see you next time.